feel like I think we have talked before in like branch meetings, but I don't know if we've ever met face to face. And so this isn't face to face either, but still, it's great to talk.
It's better than nothing.
Better than nothing. Yeah.
We probably have met face to face. I'm terrible with names. I sometimes forget people in my own band. I think Eric actually talked about this.
Yeah, well,
when you interviewed him. But
Wasatch District might be the only band where that's perfectly understandable.
I'm working on it.
There might be people in your band you haven't even met yet, Mark. So that's okay.
There is that. Yes.
But our community's small. I'm sure we have come across each other before.
Yeah,
it's great to be able to talk. And so first on my docket here, the first thing I want to know: how do you pronounce your last name?
My last name is pronounced Pekkonen.
Well, that's not as bad as I thought it would be. Pekkonen.
It's a Finnish name, and in general, when you pronounce Finnish words, the first syllable gets a little accent on it, stress. So Pekkonen is how you say it. Yeah.
Well, now my brain is racing trying to think of a really great joke, to use the word Finnish instead of the word finished. But I'm too sluggish right now. I can't think of anything.
Oh, you're all good. We once had a themed Christmas dinner called "I'm Finnish with Christmas," and
nice.
We made all Finnish dishes for it. It was good.
What are Finnish dishes? I feel like fish.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Like step one is procure a large quantity of salmon, pretty much.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then it's a lot of fish, but it's also sort of on that's sort of a light side, but on a darker, heavier side, it's a lot of rye bread and kind of like more stodgy stuff. It's kind of a weird blend, actually. I don't mind it. It's good.
Have you ever spent any time in Finland?
I've never been. I'd like to. Yeah.
Was it, you mentioned to me before, was it your mother, or no, your father's side, right? Of course, you got the last name. But it wasn't your father who was born in Finland, right? It was a generation further?
That's correct. It was his father, yes. So my grandfather was born in Finland, got kind of tangled up in the Finnish-Russian war that occurred right after the end of the First World War, and was brought back to the UK by some British soldiers who were out there helping the Finns fight the Russians.
Yeah.
But I guess it was the Soviets at that point.
Careful, because someone might be listening that would be offended. So
they might be, but yeah, it is what it is. And so the British soldiers, in a rather strange manner, just suggested that they bring this boy who they thought was orphaned back to the UK. So they did.
No way.
It turned out later
they were
that
just
he wasn't.
Put him on the boat. We'll just take him with us.
They brought him back. Yes, I have copies of the letters that they wrote. It was very strange. They wrote a letter to their commanding officer saying, "Please, may we take this boy home?" And the commanding officer wrote them a letter back, like a permission slip, saying, "Sure."
Like a puppy. They're just "Look, we found this kid. We want to take him home. We'll take care of him. We promise. We'll feed him and water him every day. He can sleep next to our cot."
That was pretty much it. Yeah, and it so they brought him back, and then apparently upon return, the soldier who'd requested it, his wife said, "Well, absolutely not," because he hadn't already consulted with her, and so a different family took him on, and he was raised from the age of 7 in the UK as kind of a British, like English country boy, basically, and so so because of that, I have this weird Finnish name, which I otherwise wouldn't have.
Very across multiple generations, very culturally British, huh?
Yes, yeah.
But isn't that's got to say something about like a man's brain too. That he's like, well, I checked with my commanding officer, sweetie. Why isn't this okay with you?
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about like 1919 here now, right? So, what was thought to be logical and acceptable back then was quite different, especially since we'd just come out of the First World War, which was neither logical nor acceptable, really, was it?
Wow. Hey, let's get deep right now, man. Let's talk. Hey, actually, it's an obscure thing, but like lately, music-wise, some of the folk music that came out of Finland and out of Russia and what is that? Belarus? Is that the little country that's west of Russia?
Up in that corner, you're talking about places like Estonia and Lithuania.
Right, Estonia and stuff. Yeah. The music that came out of that time in that part of the world is really digging its way into my ear lately. There's some
interesting,
beautiful folk music from out there.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's okay. So we got started. We got started with one side of the family, but the other side of the family, you got some Scotland coming into you, right?
Indeed, yes, yeah. It's
Is that the same kind of story? Did someone get kidnapped and brought across to England? Or?
No one that I'm aware of was kidnapped. The Scottish side of my family sort of is on my mother's side, and it sort of came from various parts of Scotland. The part I know the most about is on my mother's father's side, because they were MacPhees, and they had a lot of money eventually. I mean, they didn't initially when they were just Highlanders. They were poor as dirt, but as were so many. But as time went by and the MacPhees kind of moved into the city, or my branch of the family anyway, became... they got into like the whale oil business in the 1700s, which I gather was quite big. But then gas lighting replaced whale oil, like oil lamps. And so when that happened, they got out of the whale oil business and got into sugar refining.
Oh, gotcha.
And they became quite wealthy. So there was kind of MacPhees was a brand of sugar that was quite prevalent, kind of right through the 1800s and into the early 1900s. And so I know more about that family because rich people tended to have their lives documented a little bit better than poor people, right? So I can trace that back quite nicely. But all of the other portions of my family on my mother's side are Scottish, either Highland or Lowland, to some extent or another.
Well, and I don't want to skip ahead to the Christmas gag that brought you into bagpiping, but we'll put a pin in that, and then I want to circle back to it.
Sure.
So those are the streams that ran together to bring us what the man that is Marc Pekkanen. But you were born in England then, right?
Yep.
Were you
I lived
born
in England
Bath,
until
or
I was.
Did you just go to school in Bath?
I was born in not far from Bath, but I grew up. I was born in a town called Cirencester, which is an old Roman town originally.
Cool.
It's about 2 hours to the west of London, which Bath is also actually. They're not too far apart. So I grew up there. It's a little country town. It's probably comparable in size to Logan, I would say, if you wanted a point of reference.
But with Roman ruins.
But with Roman ruins throughout, yes. Yeah, that. So, so I grew up, it's a sort of a quiet rural town. And then when it came time to go to university, I chose Bath University, which is a very, also a very ancient Roman town, and then became a big regency town where people would go to take the waters. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. So the whole Jane Austen thing, of course, is from that time period as well.
If I ever get a chance to go to England, that is one of the stops I'm going to make is Bath, and I'm definitely going to put on full-on Regency regimentals.
Good for you.
Because I know what catches my wife's eye, and it's a red coat.
Right. There you go.
And we're going to go take the waters for sure.
Yeah, they're pretty gross actually.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I wonder if they've only become gross after hundreds of years of people,
I wonder, double dipping.
Yep, exactly. Maybe they once were what they promised to be.
Yeah, I went to university in Bath, but I had a break in the middle of that to go to Scotland. Actually, I lived and worked in Scotland because I did an intern year. It was part of my degree. So I actually went, although I'd never actually I'd been to Scotland once on vacation prior to that, but that was my first actual sort of immersion into Scotland was when I was, I guess, the year I turned 21.
And since then, obviously, you've moved around a bit because now you're in Utah. But at the time, for me, looking from here over across the Atlantic, from this angle, they blend into the same landmass, really, But for you, was that at 21? Was it at all a culture shock to be going from England to Scotland? Was it a big difference?
It was a huge culture shock, and it was also one that I wasn't prepared for, because I actually had the same sort of outlook as you just mentioned. I thought, well, it's just Scotland; it can't be that different from here. I think the reason it was such a big culture shock is because when I moved there, I became aware of how much poverty there was in Scotland, and my rural town where I'd grown up just didn't have anything like that. It was both rural and well off, reasonably well off.
Not one of those rural towns.
Yeah, when I moved to Scotland, I was working for BP. I think they're still around. It's an oil company, and they had an oil refinery, which is where I worked. And so I lived in a small town next to it called Bowness, and it was just it was the late 80s. So the unemployment of the Thatcher era had really bitten hard in Scotland. Many people were out of work. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of drug use, a lot of crime. And there I was, going from my comfortable middle class existence to live in what just felt like the third world country. It was pretty shocking, actually. Yeah.
And not to make light of the suffering that was happening at the time, but and maybe this is inaccurate. This is somewhat ignorant because, of course, I grew up over here. I don't know exactly what it would have been like there, but it seems to me like that that poverty of the mid to late '80s, though of course being difficult, is also part of sort of like the soil in which was planted some of the coolest punk music that like ever existed. Would that have happened if it weren't for hardship? I wonder.
I know, yes, yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, sure. Let's look at it that way. Yeah, I mean, there's no question that that kind of unrest and sort of misery breeds resistance, and the UK in the 1980s was a hotbed of creativity and resistance because of what was going on there. And yeah, you're right. There was it was actually. Although it was a culture shock being there, it was one of the best years of my life being there too, because I completely immersed myself in that whole scene.
Yeah.
And this is pre bagpiping, which is kind of ironic, right?
It's
but yeah, I was
yeah, exactly. Your pipes when you were there.
Yeah, if I had a nickel. But yes, I was totally engrossed in that. I've always been involved in music from before I could remember almost. So
yes, but not punky music. Tell me about your boyhood choir boy days.
Yeah, so I grew up singing in the parish church choir in that rural town I told you about. It had a very enormous parish church. It was almost the size of a cathedral, actually. Very wealthy they were.
That's awesome.
And I started singing in that church choir from the age of 6. The choir director his name was Reverend John Beck. He was probably the biggest influence on my young musical life of anyone, I would say, because there I was under his tutelage from the age of just about 6 or 7, to sing really brilliantly and to sing very difficult music. And so he threw a very difficult, challenging repertoire at us.
Yeah.
And so week in, week out, we were learning, Latin masses from people like, Mozart and Haydn and Bach, and we sang the full kind of range of really the most difficult English choral music that there is.
Now, if I'm imagining young Marc singing in this choir, if the image that comes to my mind is a young boy with a bowl cut and wearing choir robes and singing falsetto, is that far off the mark, or is that about right?
It's exactly the mark.
All right.
Yes, the choir rehearsed three times a week and sang 2 services on Sundays. So wow. It was a very big time commitment as well. Yeah. So I was more focused on singing at that age than I was on my schoolwork, because I spent just so much time there. So on the plus side, it's like when you learn a language at a young age, you become fluent quite quickly. I was able to sight read from like anything pretty much from the age of 8, I would say.
And that's also an intense turnaround or turnover of repertoire there.
Yeah, and as it turned out, once I became a piper, the new thing was to memorize music, which I'd not had to do before. However, I found that because I could sight read and I was such a sponge, that I've never had a problem learning tunes fairly quickly and then retaining them sort of forever.
Yeah.
So it definitely helped me out later.
So all parents listening, get your kids in with an intense choir now.
That's right. Yeah, get into music as soon as you possibly can. Yeah. You'll never regret it. Yeah. I guess assuming that you have good teachers and whatnot.
Yeah, of course. There's the what was that great film? Now I can't remember the name of it, with the drum teacher who was insane and abusive. Of course, there are different ways of teaching, I suppose.
There are different ways of doing it. Yeah. I was fortunate. I didn't have that kind of experience. It was relentlessly positive. Yeah, it was great.
Well, that's awesome. So, music moving along with you from England into Scotland. Mm-hmm. How the heck did you end up in Utah?
I ended up in Utah through happenstance.
Don't get me wrong. I love Utah. I was born here and I love it, but like, how the heck, Yeah.
So it wasn't a choice to come here. It was sort of it fell into my lap, I guess. I was traveling in the US in 1993. Mm-hmm. So what was I, 28 at that time? I was traveling in the US, and I was traveling up the West Coast, and while I was visiting a national park called Crater Lake National Park. I bumped into a woman who I fell into conversation with, and as we drove around the lake, we kept stopping at the same overlooks because that's what happens. There's only one road there, right? So once you start driving, you're going to keep stopping at the same point as the person that started at the same time as you.
Mark, you're building a cinematic image in my mind. Beautiful scenery, a beautiful girl. You keep seeing this meet cute moment from the rom-com.
It was the best meet cute, yeah. So by the end of the drive around the lake, we established that there were all these things we had in common. You mentioned my time in Scotland. She'd actually worked in Scotland at the same time that I did, also for BP.
Really?
Although she had been in their Glasgow office, and she'd come over to England, to Scotland for a year, and England, to have a year, to experience the country. Sure. And so we were working there at the same time, although we'd never bumped into each other.
How fun.
We had this similar interests. You mentioned the punk music. We were both into that. We both were knitters.
Really?
And,
no way. When did you start knitting, Mark?
I had started knitting just a few years before that, as an adult.
Or was it therapy?
It was because I really wanted to be able to knit. That was literally
cool.
just it. And my mother was a very, very good knitter, and she showed me how, because I pleaded with her to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we had all these things in common. We traded addresses and went our separate ways, and one thing led to another, and we ended up getting married. And
how long transpired between meeting at this beautiful lake and then getting married?
Well, it wasn't very long. She told me I should visit her. She was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. Ah. She told me I should visit her on the way back to the UK, because I was on this world trip. I was on my way to New Zealand, actually, to visit other family members. So I visited her on the way back to Washington, and it still clearly was going well.
Yeah.
And so I said, so that was like for about a week, and so then I flew back to the UK, and so I told her she should come and visit me in the UK, which she did, and we got engaged that the first day she arrived. So I guess
why not? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right?
Yeah, we'd spent exactly 6 days, I think, in each other's company at that point in time when we got engaged. So
that's great.
Yeah, and that was 27 years ago. So we got married the following year, and we're still married now. It's like
there you go.
Good for us.
That's awesome, Mark. What a great story.
I should say she is from Utah originally, though, and that you asked why Utah. Well, that's the reason why, because she's from here. I forgot why. I got swept up in the romance of it all. She grew up here, and when I met her up in Oregon, she was just there. She was taking a detour because she had been at a conference. So professionally, she was a folklorist.
Really?
And she had been at a folklore conference, and after it was over, she just decided to go and do some sightseeing.
That is so cool. Yeah. Man, if I can ever muster up the time and resources to go to school, folklorism is precisely what I am most interested in.
Yeah,
that's very cool.
I can see from your interests that would make sense. Yeah,
you're very perceptive.
When I met her, she was just finishing kind of a job at the Smithsonian in Washington D.C.
Yeah,
and she was getting ready to go back to graduate school. So she was professionally a folklorist, but getting ready to become a student again. So she went back to school to get her PhD, and so she was just getting ready to move to Buffalo, New York. So to do her PhD there. So when we got married, I moved to Buffalo with her. So for the first 10 years of our marriage, that's where we lived, and then after 10 or so years, we moved back here to Utah, where she grew up. And so that's where we've been ever since. So
I feel like all I ever hear about Buffalo is that it's very cold.
It is cold. Yep.
There's more to it than that, though, right?
It's not really colder than here.
Yeah.
But it stays colder for longer. Was what I found. Like here, the spring shows up in sort of March, maybe April. But in Buffalo, the ice and snow would drag on right through May.
Winter to summer.
Yeah, it's more pleasant here. The cold is sort of a little more tightly bound.
Yeah. Mark, when you first started telling me about your life, I thought that I wanted to be you because your life sounds so fun. But now I think I'd rather be your wife because her life sounds really cool, and then I could be married to you, so I'd get everything.
Wow,
it'd be awesome.
Well, I'll keep you posted, but we're good for now.
Things are going well so far, so
yeah. So
right.
Yeah. Maybe in another 27 years we can review, but yeah.
So, was it in Buffalo that you picked up the pipes?
It was actually, yes, yeah. So it was while I was there, sort of towards the tail end of our stay there, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yes, yeah, I kind of fell into that. Yeah, and that's where I learned.
Yeah, and so how did that happen? Your not exactly Scottish mother made a mistake, I think, is what she, is that how she would say today?
I'm not sure if I'd characterize it as a mistake. She always, my mother was always could give you good presents, right? She came up with these funny gifts that were often a bit quirky.
Yeah.
And one particular year, she sent me this box, and in it was a brown practice chanter and a CD that said "Teach Yourself the Bagpipes." And she told me that she thought it might be fun or funny or both. Just because of our Scottish background and because of my musical background, she thought it would make sense. And so it was sort of partly a joke, but not completely joking. It was it was well tailored, I guess, to my my interests.
Yeah.
So I got this thing, and I started to sort of play around with it. The CD was just terrible. It had some it was like a very poor quality practice chanter. I mean, honestly, this thing probably
splinters, not all the
the thing probably cost $10. I bet you. Right? It was it really wasn't high quality at all. Yeah. And I remember that the little music book that came with it had no grace notes in it either. So it wasn't really a bona fide piping book at all. So I played around with this thing for a few months, I guess, and I thought this is kind of fun, but it doesn't seem like it's really leading me anywhere.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, how do I take this to the next level if I wanted to take it more seriously? And so there was a Highland Games going on just in the Buffalo area, and I decided I'll just go there and I'll ask someone, because there's probably someone there who knows.
Bound to be a piper there, yeah.
Yeah, so, sure enough, there were pipe bands there, and I went up to one of them, and I introduced myself to the pipe major of the band, and I said, here I am, I've got this thing, I don't really know what to do with it, and what could you recommend? And he said, well, come to me for lessons. And so his name was Joe Barschnagel. He was a firefighter in the Buffalo/Niagara Falls area.
I gotta say, Joe Barschnagel is just the best upstate New York firefighter name I've ever heard in my life.
Great. He's actually of Swiss extraction originally, but his family had lived in Buffalo for several generations. But,
well, it sounds about right.
he had been part of the Buffalo piping scene for quite some time, and he had played in quite a few competitive bands, but then he'd gotten kind of tired of the sort of grind of competing, and so he'd started his own band that was more like a performance band. So they would do concerts.
It wasn't exactly a service band. It wasn't exclusively tied to his firefighting.
No, it just so happened he was a firefighter, and so, he was actually a volunteer firefighter, and so when in the middle of my lessons, his pager would go off, and he would just suddenly just drop everything and run out the door, and I'd have to just sort of leave and come back next week.
You just had your own key, just knew
pretty
what to
much,
do to lock up for him.
Yeah. But he was a very patient man. He actually he threw away my CD and my terrible book, and gave me the.
It's kind of too bad. It'd be funny relics to be able to show today, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I've no idea. That's gone now. Yeah. Yes, but. And then, I struggled along with that chanter for a little bit, but then after a while I got myself an actual, real practice chanter.
Yeah, I'd imagine you could tell the difference, huh?
Oh, yeah, and of course things went much better once I had that, and so, and then, he helped me get to the point where I could get my pipes, which I did, and so he helped me get up on pipes, and I played with that band for 2 or 3 years, I suppose, until we left Buffalo.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you had previously played oboe, saxophone, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like that made a big difference in being able to learn pipes quickly?
It had been a while since I played either of those, actually, so there'd been enough time to sort of forget some of the things. Mm-hmm. It did feel weird. Yeah. I didn't find that. I found that the skills I'd learned from singing were more transferable than the skills I'd learned from playing those other 2 instruments you mentioned, the oboe and the saxophone, I think, in the end.
No, it's just interesting. I've known a few people who have picked up pipes who, if they'd previously played clarinet or something like that, the dexterity in their fingers was helpful. But I've also known some that it's only the second language instead of the third language, and so it's like maybe to some degree actually a speed bump because you want to play your bagpipes like a clarinet. You know what I mean? So.
Exactly, yeah, and so for anyone who's played a wind instrument knows that you have to tongue the instrument, right, to make the note sound. So you tap the mouthpiece with your tongue, and that's how you separate the notes, right? Or if you want to play even more staccato, and of course that does absolutely nothing on pipes, and so you have to learn how to do that with grace notes.
Yeah,
and that's completely for me. That was a wildly different skill from anything I'd learned playing those two wind instruments, and so I didn't find them all that transferable, funnily enough.
Yeah. Did your mother, was your mother very pleased that you became a piper, or was it a surprise to her? Or how did that receive?
Yeah, I think, please, I think she was pleasantly surprised. Yeah, I mean, she'd watched me from a young age develop as a musician, so this was just like watching the same kind of loop occur again. So, yeah, I think she was very happy that I'd done that. I think my dad was also a little bit, bemused by it, perhaps. Yeah. But my dad is actually a classical composer, so he's not all that interested in folk music, which he would consider bagpiping to be.
Sure. Yeah.
I think he was a little bit. I mean, he was happy that I did it, of course, but he was not super engaged with the music.
Maybe he was more excited about the choir days early on, huh?
Well, to some extent, yeah. I mean, I said that my choir director is my biggest musical influence.
Yeah.
Which is funny, right? Because growing up with a composer, you'd think that the composer would be your biggest musical instrument, especially influence. But it wasn't. It didn't quite work like that. So
sometimes that's part of the father-son dynamic, right? Whatever your dad does is not what you want, right?
Yeah, I think my dad is. He was, especially when I was young and when he was like very actively composing, he's very sort of an introverted and kind of inwardly focused kind of guy. And so actually he didn't like it if we played music in the house.
Interesting.
Because it just got in the way of what was the music that was in his head that he was trying to write, because he would sit at the piano all day and yeah, so I actually grew up listening to a lot less music than my peers, because it was just an interruption to him. And the same would go for when I was playing the oboe. I had to sort of find a time to practice when you couldn't hear it.
Yeah. So go out into a neighbor's barn or something, huh?
Yeah. So I mean, it's probably unfair to say he just tolerated my musical endeavors, but they were we definitely had to figure out how to mesh the two.
Yeah.
It didn't just go like he was like, yes, you go for it, play it all the day if you want to. It was definitely not like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting to think about, like, the difference between doing something as a hobby versus doing something professionally, and how it could change the the environment of a person's personal life, and by extension the environment for their family as well.
Yeah, I think you approach it very differently. I mean, I've been piping for long enough now that I pipe for money from time to time. So I guess you could say I pipe professionally. I don't know. I think it's more sort of incidental than professional, but I approach it in a professional manner. But my livelihood has never depended on piping. Put it that way, right? So.
I've often told customers when I've played for gigs and stuff, and they ask about that kind of thing, like, no, I have a day job. This is basically a hobby that almost pays for itself. I
think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Hello, friends. Just a quick note to make you aware, this podcast is something that I love doing, and I will keep doing it no matter what. But if you want to send me money, I won't say a nay. The easiest way to do that is through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/DroningOnPodcast. We do regular drawings for bagpipey albums, books, sheet music, and more, including Droning On swag. All patrons are in the figurative hat from whence the names of winners are drawn, and there are other benefits to members as well. They're all listed there at patreon.com/DroningOnPodcast. And speaking of swag, another way to support the show is to buy cool stuff from my little online shop, bagpipeswag.com. There you can find Droning On stuff, as well as other pipey and drummy things that my friends and I make. And if you feel so inclined, I genuinely invite you to follow the show on Facebook. It's super fun to have a way to interact over there, to discuss past episodes, and I also like to bounce ideas off of you, my friends, ask you for input on upcoming interviews, that kind of stuff. I'd like to invite you to join in on virtual book clubs and probably lots of other cool stuff that I just haven't even thought of yet as of this recording. It's easy to find. Just get on Facebook and search Droning On Podcast. And if Instagram is more your jam, we're also on there at droning.on.podcast. You can also email the show at thedroningonpodcast@gmail.com. And links to these sites, social media accounts, and more are in the show notes. Leaving the show a positive rating and review helps others to find it, so feel free to do that. And thank you again for listening, you cool human you.
Well, very cool. So then you end up back in Utah already having played the pipes, and so you land directly in Wasatch, or are you floating by yourself for a little while before you join a band?
It wasn't very long. It was actually there was a sort of a gap that was just brought on by circumstance. The reason that we moved back from Buffalo to Utah when we did is because my wife's mother became sick and she had terminal cancer, and so she died not long after we moved here, and it was rather sudden. We weren't expecting it. We just thought we were moving back actually to take care of her until she was better, and then we would kind of carry on in Utah. But because she died, there was a lot of stuff to take care of. Funeral and the estate and things like that. So, what I had to sort of put off. I was kind of on a roll with piping before we left, and so I had to put that off. And then I had to I waited until the dust had settled on all of the personal stuff and family stuff. And then I thought, okay, well now I don't want to miss a beat here, so I'm going to get back. I'll find out who I should play with, and. I'd sort of fallen into the band that I was in just in Buffalo, because I'd gone to somebody, at a Highland Games. It was kind of random.
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
Just the first person I talked to.
Yeah, the very first person.
Yeah. So I was sort of, when I got to Utah, I thought, okay, well this time I'm going to be a little bit more kind of analytical about how I pick a band.
Take the same approach, just walk up to somebody at a...
No, I'm not just going to randomly walk up to someone. This time I'm going to kind of... So actually, I contacted all the bands who had a presence online, and this is like 2006. Yeah. So, the internet's up and running by then, but I'm not sure that every band in Utah had a presence, or if they did, I couldn't find them.
Right, yep.
So I did, though, go to several different bands' rehearsals and sort of scoped them out, and tried to get a sense of each band before I decided on a band. So as you say, I ended up picking Wasatch, but that was after I'd already been. I think I went down to a rehearsal with White Peaks, met some of the people there.
I know White Peaks. I grew up down in Payson.
Indeed, right? Yeah. So I live in South Jordan, so it turned out that was kind of a long drive.
Sure,
they were to visit the people, meet the people at White Peaks. They were all really, really nice to me.
Of course.
And I thought, wow, this would be a great band to join. But when I thought at that time, there was massive construction on I-15, and I thought, wow, if every Thursday I have to drive 40 miles through all this construction, both two ways.
Right, it's 40 miles in 2 hours too. So.
Yeah. So that kind of weighed against it a bit. Otherwise, I might well have joined. If they'd been 5 minutes drive down the road, I probably would have jumped in with them. Yeah. I went to visit the Salt Lake Scots. I attended one of their rehearsals. Actually, I attended rehearsal. I tried to play along with each band.
Yeah.
And I think that was a bit unusual, maybe, just to show up with pipes and start trying to play.
Yeah.
But so I attended the Salt Lake Scots. They were all very nice to me as well.
Mm-hmm. Lovely.
And I think that time they had two bands. They had a grade 3 and a grade 4 band, essentially. I sort of sat in on each of the rehearsals with them. For some reason, I think that the Utah Pipe Band didn't have a web presence or something, because for some reason I was unaware of the existence of that band.
Yeah, you managed to not find them.
For some reason, I don't know that they definitely didn't have a web presence, or I just was unable to find it because I was very bad at doing internet searches. But
Jeeves didn't dish up the...
Yeah, Ask Jeeves or Alta Vista at the time.
Yeah.
So they weren't in the lottery through no fault of their own, I think.
Yeah.
And then I found my way to Wasatch. It was the same deal. I found them online, and there was a contact number you could call, and so I called it. I think it was Jeff Mann actually who was the person at that time. Yeah. He said, "Yeah, we rehearse at Bountiful High School. Come along." So I did that. And actually, this probably sounds a bit trivial, but actually the deciding factor that kind of clinched it for me was when I went to their rehearsal. At that time, they had quite a lot of members that were in their 30s and who had youngish kids.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the band parents, and because they rehearsed in the high school, they used a whole suite of classrooms. Because Andrew, who was the pipe major at the time, he was a math teacher there, and he had access to the whole sort of math area. So they had 4 or 5 classrooms, and one of the classrooms was a creche, actually, for the children for all of the band members.
A creche.
I'm sorry, that's the English version of it.
I was going to say, I think I can deduce what this is, but
right,
I think I see what you mean. Yeah, like a nursery,
like childcare.
Yeah,
childcare. Right,
yeah, gotcha.
So, and I've been taking my kids to band practice in Buffalo for several years, actually.
They just had to sit there with headphones on or something, huh?
Well, yeah, they were little. You know, my wife was busy with her PhD, and so, you know, that was sort of part of, like, conditions, if you like, of me being able to pipe was that I would sort of take the kids out of her hair and bring them along to band practice. And so I wanted to keep doing that when I got here, and one of the parents had activities lined up. It was quite organized. She had, so your kids were doing things, puzzles and drawing and stuff like that while I was piping. So that sort of said, well, if Wasatch is going to also have childcare, then I'll go for that.
Man, there's a tactic right there. You got to provide your band members services.
It's childcare. I know, interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So I, you know, I mean, I listened to the band play, and I thought, well, you know, they seem okay, they seem good.
But really, that's secondary to the fact that they provide childcare.
They provide childcare. Yeah, you've got to remember at this time I was just barely into piping for 2 or 3 years, and the band that I was playing with, you know, also did things like have keyboards and guitars with it. So I didn't know I don't think I would have known how to tell what was, you know, how to differentiate the quality of the bands. Actually, all three of the bands that I went to were better than the band in Buffalo. So
they were all like actively competing and stuff, right? So
exactly. So when I heard them play, I was like, "Whoa! You know, this is whoever I join, it's going to be a step up."
Yeah.
So I wasn't really like trying to figure out which one was the most proficient because they all sounded like quite a bit better than what I was used to.
Yeah. Well, you know, and from the outside looking in, Wasatch, that's the thing that's always been impressive to me about Wasatch is like organization. Man, it's a well-oiled machine. I've said it too many times, I'm sure, but it doesn't surprise me that they would have a well-organized creche as well as other things.
I'm not sure that isn't still in place. I have to hasten to add. I mean,
well, doesn't
mean that we couldn't do it again.
Hey, Andrew, let's do it.
Yeah,
let's get this going. You want to recruit some more people to build up the lower band so you can get that grade 2 pushed up a little further.
Yeah.
You know, let's have some childcare.
Get some childcare going. Yep.
Yeah. Now, so you joined it, and that was in 2006. If I'm remembering right, hadn't Wasatch only just started like 2004 or so? Like pretty.
That's correct. Yeah.
Not all that long before.
I knew nothing. I knew nothing about this. Absolutely nothing. I didn't bother to ask them how long they've been around.
Sure.
And I also, having just moved here, I knew nothing about the piping scene in Utah. I knew nothing about the history of piping in Utah. It was just a kind of I'll pick you kind of situation.
Sure, yeah. So, but I'd imagine you probably felt like you were coming into this extremely established thing, which, to be fair, it was because a lot of these people had been piping together for a very long time, piping and drumming together. However,
I guess
you kind of were on the ground floor to some degree. I mean, especially at this point, you've been with the band the majority of its existence. So
I know, it's funny, isn't it? Yeah, and yet it's still the case, I would say, in Wasatch. There's a group of people who were there from the start, who kind of carried over from, I guess they'd all been in the Utah Pipe Band prior to that, pretty much. So that group of people has a different institutional memory than anyone who came after that. Myself included. So, it's not that there's a separation between any of us, but it does mean that you carry different memories into the band with you, right?
Yeah, naturally. Yeah.
So so if you were one of the people that bridged that transition, I think your experience of Utah piping is probably different than if you didn't, like myself, for example.
Yeah, I think I've talked to a lot of people about it. That it's definitely not just me. That a lot of other people have mentioned that they also feel the same way, that like the Utah bagpiping scene has been surprisingly tribal and kind of territorial in the past, but that it is not nearly so much so anymore. Definitely moving in the right direction of being friendly and all being one big family.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much one person can do, but I've always tried to be as friendly and integrative and as I can. Right?
Actually, Mark, I think things started to turn around in 2006, so it's.
Oh, okay.
I think you might actually be precisely the impetus for change. So go ahead.
I don't know about that, but yeah. I mean, I've never hesitated because I have no history with anybody here in Utah.
Yeah.
but both on a band and on a personal and a cultural level.
Yeah,
basically.
Man,
I'm
you're
like
as much an import as you could be, aren't you?
Totally, yeah. I'm a completely clean slate in that sense. So I try to always act without ever like taking on the baggage that anybody else might have for myself. Because why would I? So yeah.
Now, I don't want to skip through the other stuff, but I've been just like anxiously awaiting the chance to ask you what the heck you did. You mentioned in this write-up that you gave to me that you played pipes for a burlesque show.
Oh yes, yeah.
What how did tell me all about this, man?
Okay, well, I don't know if it's actually it's probably less salacious than it sounds.
So should we just leave it? Just be like, yes, I played pipes for a burlesque show, and just leave it.
I have played pipes for a burlesque show. It was fun. It was a good gig actually, and So I guess what's more interesting about that is the reason why I was there in the first place. Because I've tried not when I mentioned I've tried not to tie myself too much to the tribal scene, like you might say.
Yeah.
I've also tried not to put all my eggs into one basket, piping wise, and so once I got established in Wasatch, I still kind of missed the sort of freewheeling kind of piping that I've been doing in Buffalo with the band that had guitars and stuff. And so it was probably after a couple of more years, maybe 2007 or 8, that I kind of made the acquaintance of Mike Gibbs.
Yeah.
And got into the Heathen Highlanders, right? And so what they were doing was playing in bars basically at that time, and that I'd never really done, but it was much more like what I'd been doing in Buffalo, and I kind of missed that, kind of rough and ready piping.
Yeah.
And so I joined the Heathen Highlanders, and it was actually the burlesque gig that I mentioned was a gig that they got.
Yeah.
They were asked to play at the opening of a burlesque show that was being set up. And in fact, the organizer of that, a woman called Jen Teresevich, is someone who I've known now for quite a few years, not just through the sort of agency that she runs, which does these kind of, exotic performers type things. I guess I'm technically an exotic performer now.
But piper, all right.
But yeah, on and off because of other connections, I've now known her for quite a few years. Yeah, she's a great person. But she was the one who organised that burlesque show, and she did several of those actually. Her group was called the Voodoo Darlings, and it was a lot of fun actually. It may sound it sounds more racy than it really is, to be honest. It was.
Don't apologize for it, Mark. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it's.
I hope you have a mini kilt that you wear for those burlesque shows.
I didn't. I wore my normal kilt. I'm not gonna. I will never put on a mini kilt for anybody.
Not even for
no one needs to see that. I'll let Eric Evenhouse do that.
There you go. He'd do it, wouldn't he?
He'd do it. Yeah, he'd do it. He probably has.
He's probably waiting for somebody to ask. He's got one ready to go.
I think so. Yeah.
Now, and just for anybody who doesn't know already, the Heathen Highlanders, I'm only vaguely aware. Like, I saw the cool video that they did a few years ago at Hale Center with the stages rising out of the mist and stuff like that.
Yes.
Is it usually like around a quartet, quintet or so, kind of a smaller group of pipes and drums, or is it pipes exclusively? What's kind of the makeup of the group?
Pipes and drums, and whoever else sort of is like hanging around. Yeah, I mean, if you ask Mike Gibbs, he started it with Dave Glad quite a few years ago because I think both of them were become disenchanted with the band scene, and they wanted an outlet for their piping.
And so they became Heathens.
And then once they started doing that, it's like other people who were interested in sort of being involved with that kind of piping sort of attached themselves, and it's not an official organization. It's more of a group that's sort of anchored by Mike and Dave.
Yeah, I get the impression it's kind of fluid, like how many people
show up
at the gig and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a fairly regular member. Like, I'm not really a member. I play with them. For a decade or more now. So, and Hale, the video you mentioned was recorded on the back end of us being booked to play for Brigadoon.
Yeah.
So Mike got that booking, and we played for every performance of Brigadoon. We divvied it up amongst ourselves because it's just a solo piping gig. So one or other of the Heathen Highlanders played at every performance, and we at the end of it all, we asked if we could use their stage to make that video.
Yeah.
And they said yes. Video.
I'll dig it up and put a link in the show notes if anybody wants to see it. It's very cool. Really enjoyed it.
Oh, it was fun. Yeah, that stage. In fact, during the performance, the opening scene, the piper is the person who starts the performance.
Oh, really?
And you come up on that rotating stage from below the stage up through the mist playing.
Yeah, that's cool.
that's the opening of the show. I loved doing that. It was opening those shows in Brigadoon. That's been 10 years ago now almost. It's been surprising how long ago that was.
Weird. Yeah, and that's, I don't know if anybody listening hasn't been to the Hale Center Theater here locally. It's a theater in the round, and so it makes any production interesting in that way. But yeah, I'll link to the video, and anybody can get an idea what that stage space is like, and you'll be able to see what that visual would be like to open up a show. I imagine it's very dark, lights only shining from the fog and mist as it comes up.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, it was great.
Like the city of Brigadoon itself, up here.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
I did a Brigadoon a little while ago, but it was a smaller local community theater, not nearly as much of a production, but it was fun for sure. Lots of fun. I can imagine that Hale Center would have been great.
It's been a few years. I think they should do it again. It's probably time.
Yeah.
They do rotate their shows, so it's not just their stage.
Right. Not just the stage, right. They've got the new
I would say though that exactly right. Yeah, that was before they moved to the new facility. I would say though that actually one of the ways I was able to meet people from other bands was actually playing in the Heathen Highlanders, because as part of their rotating kind of roster of people, there are people who played with other bands, right? Who come and play with the Heathen. So that's how I kind of met several other people who were connected to Utah piping quite independently, along the way. I met Ian Williams, for example, I think through the Heathen Highlanders probably initially, and also people like Jason Hansen, who plays drums, top guy, right? And so, all these people that were playing with other groups, Jesse Fry, like all these great people that I play with in the Heathens play in other bands.
Yeah.
Other bands than Wasatch, I should say.
And you've got still other baskets that you're putting your bagpiping eggs into. Did you helped start the Pibrook Society here? That I feel like, did that start right when COVID started, and is that part of what had made it so it kind of started and has kind of paused a bit, or had it started before COVID?
Oh no, it started quite a long time before that. Yeah,
so that's just my awareness, I guess.
It's been through. I'm not sure I could say I started it, because it didn't really continue. We started a Pibrook Society in Utah. Myself, Justin Howland, and Johnny Miner, and a couple of other people kind of got together, probably in about 2000 and I want to say 9 maybe. Just gathering at each other's houses just to play over tunes, really.
Honestly, that I think is before I even knew what a Pibrook is, and which is embarrassing to me because I've been playing pipes for years and years, but I just didn't even know about the musical form until about 2010 or 11. Yeah,
I sort of became aware of it. Although the band in Buffalo was kind of a freewheeling show band, the pipe major was also a fan of Pibrook, and so he did teach me a couple of grounds. He wasn't really like a Pibrook player, but he was a fan of it, I guess.
Sure.
So I was aware of the music, and I knew about it, and I really liked it. Like, it was because I've always liked odd, kind of weird music from when I was little. I don't really make a distinction between what it is really. If it's unusual and interesting to the ear, then it gets my attention, and so
if bagpipes are niche, then Pibrook is niche within a niche.
Absolutely, yeah. But I became instantly hooked when I first heard Pibrook. It was very much like I felt like it was like that sort of New York minimalist music that I'd always liked, that had these kind of repetitive, cyclical music. But yeah, anyway, so a small group of us sort of started to meet and play Pibrook once a month, and that sort of that burned quite strongly for about 2 or 3 years, I guess. But then it sort of fell off, and so then there was a fairly long period when we didn't do much, and then we kind of tried to resurrect it again, which is probably when you became aware of it. And then we also when COVID hit, I also sort of started a Facebook page called COVID Kelmore.
Yes, I posted to it.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. That turned out to be just what was
20
needed.
years ago, right?
It just seems like it, doesn't it? It seems so long ago. Yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, I've maintained kind of an interest in Pibrook and gathering with people. Once again, it's a cross-band venture, though. We've got people from the Salt Lake Scots, who come, and it's been a nice way to meet people from other bands.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. So, I mean, have you ever competed with a Pibrook?
Yes, yeah. I haven't competed solo for a few years, but yeah, as soon as I started competing, I started competing with Pembroke as soon as I was able to. Yes. Yeah.
I admire that you were able to love it immediately. It was very boring to me at first. It took
Interesting. Yeah.
It took work for me to start loving it, and it was actually when I started hearing arrangements of Pembroke played with some supporting instruments behind it. That's when it clicked for me, and now I can enjoy Pembroke just plain vanilla. But it took some work for me to get into it actually.
That makes sense, yeah, actually. And going back to your earlier comment, actually, when you were talking about folk music from that corner of Finland and Russia, there's a lot of drone-based kind of singing and other performances that come out of there. I think that's I forget the names of some of these groups that do this though, but they're it's pretty interesting actually. A lot of this Nordic music that is sort of like, I think it meshes with Pembroke very nicely actually. It's like they're quite long songs or tunes. They kind of go round and round. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
I've wondered before about that, if there's something about sort of the subcut of society that ends up playing in pipe bands. If we're all also drawn to basically any drone style music, whether that be clawhammer banjo or throat singing or hurdy-gurdies, these things are all kind of niche instruments again. So maybe it's an interest in the non-standard instrument, but it also seems like maybe there's a theme here that has to do with the drone. There's something about that.
I could definitely see that. Yeah, I find myself drawn to it very much so. Yeah, and including some of these older types of bagpipes, and you mentioned hurdy-gurdy as well. I mean, it's sort of my future project bucket list thing is to build a hurdy-gurdy and learn how to play
Mark,
it.
let me know if you ever get started, because that's top of my list as well.
Yeah,
Have you been aware of the nerdy-gurdy kits that you can get wood cut and you can assemble them?
I believe, they're a kit. Yeah. This is kind of on my list of things to do. So yeah, I'll one of these days I think I'm going to do that. I love the sound of the hurdy-gurdy. I think it's fascinating.
Oh, me too. Yeah. Well, let me know if you dive into it. I'll do the same. And we can,
I will do. Yeah, we should start a group, huh?
Yeah. So music has been like with you throughout, and I wonder, do you feel like looking back, the fact that as a child you mentioned that you sang in big places, Royal Albert Hall.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm.
David Gilmour played there. You got to stand there and play where he was, and others.
Of Pink Floyd?
Yes, of Pink Floyd. All right, this shows this is how high my brows go.
Yeah, I don't think I'm not sure I would associate the Royal Albert Hall with Pink Floyd immediately. But
you're right. That was a bad association for me.
Yes.
I should have gone to a chamber choir or something instead, right? But I'm just saying, like, you've been in big places since before you would have known, and like, I imagine that as a child you wouldn't have known you should have been nervous, like it would have just been like, oh, this is where we're singing today. So now today, when you go play Brigadoon or go do a gig with Heathen Highlanders, do you ever get nervous? Ever?
I always get nervous before any kind of public performance, but I never get excessively nervous, should we say. So depending on what it is, there's a little flutter of nerves.
Sure.
But I think you're right. Having been used to putting myself in front of a large audience from a young age, just the fact of there being an audience isn't particularly scary to me, should we say. I think I sang my first solo in the church choir when I was probably 8. And then as those few years before my voice broke came along, I got into singing bigger and bigger things, very challenging stuff. And so I was confident in my ability to stand in front of an audience and do that. Later on, I had to learn how to speak in front of an audience, like, do public speaking. And that was sort of, I got nervous all over again, but then figured out how to do public speaking. And so now, I'm generally the MC for our band's concerts.
Well, and it makes sense. You got a nice voice anyway, but that accent as well,
I think the band likes it.
Yeah.
And so most of the time, for about the last 10 years, I've been the MC for any shows that we've had.
Yeah.
And what that's done is I no longer have nerves over public speaking, shall we say.
Yeah.
The Brigadoon thing was nerve-wracking. I'd never played, on a stage like that. So the first couple,
that is kind of a unique experience.
But once again, after the first couple of shows were under my belt, I looked forward to it. It was like there's always a little flutter before you strike in. Just like, am I going to get this right? And so off you go. Same with solo piping. The first time I ever played a solo competition, which I think was probably at Salt Lake Games, I was pretty nervous. But then after I'd done it a couple of times, I'm like, this is great. This is a lot of fun. So I don't ever suffer from nerves once I've kind of got, familiar with something.
Yeah.
When I do a lot of funerals, or I have done a lot of funerals over the years, I'm always, just when you're getting ready, that's probably the most nerve-wracking moment that I still have, because you only get one chance to do it. So you have to know that you're you have to know that you're confident enough to do it.
Yeah.
And that that this is like for me, actually, playing for funerals is probably the pinnacle of my piping, I would say. Actually, despite all the other things I've done, that someone would entrust you to do that is it never ceases to be very humbling to me. And so I always want to do a good job. So, I always show up as early as I possibly can. I'm prepped, I'm ready, I know anything that could possibly go wrong, I've got a backup plan for what would happen if it did, and I'm ready to roll. So, so nerves these days are a lot less of an issue, I would say, than they ever were.
That makes sense. I've heard, like, well-performed musicians, by which I just mean people who have spent a lot of time in front of crowds, talking about it as, like, if you spend enough hours, if your playing is such that, like, your practice, you could say that you're practicing in front of a crowd, and that's not to say that you're, like, not polishing up your playing, so you do have a performance ready, but it's just like, rather than putting in a lot of hours practicing by yourself and then going to perform, you've put in so many hours performing that it's almost like that's, as big a thing in terms of hours spent playing your instrument. You've spent a lot of hours playing your instrument in front of people. That's kind of the only way to kind of fight down the negative side of nerves.
I would fully agree with that. Yeah, I mean, perhaps I'm disposed to it. I know that there are people I'm familiar with, pipers, who've been playing for years and still get terribly nervous. So, maybe it's not universal, but I count myself fortunate, I guess, that doesn't happen to me.
Yeah.
I recall being very nervous actually when I first started playing with Wasatch and I first started doing band competitions.
Yeah, sometimes the nerves come from being with your peers, right? You don't want to let them down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you screw up a solo, you just crash and burn on your own.
Yeah.
But if you have a giant early E or you're howling drone throughout the whole run, you can mess up your band's performance, even if they were
down with you.
You can, yeah. And so that was pretty nerve-wracking for me until I'd done it enough that I was confident that and my instrument set up, and that it wouldn't do any of those things.
Yeah.
At least, then you could just focus on getting the tunes right. But yeah, some of those basic things that you just don't want to mess up are a little bit nerve-wracking.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take away any of the weight of having said that funerals are probably like the most meaningful or important thing, and I can relate to that. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I am curious, of all the piping that you do on a regular basis, is the Pride Parade the most fun that you have? Because that looks like a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun.
Yes,
the Pride Pipers has been an interesting gig as well. That's another avenue of my piping. And it's a funny thing, really, because that's really just once a year. Sometimes there's an extra performance associated with it, but pretty much it's just once a year.
But are we going on 3 years that COVID has canceled it, or only 2? It's all like a time warp. So
it's been 2, but if it doesn't make it again this year, that will be 3. But yes, it's been just the last 2 years. But yeah, prior to that, every year I've participated every year since I think 2009. And the first year we did it, there were just 2 of us. It was just myself and Sean Newton.
Oh, good old Sean. I went to high school with Sean.
Yeah. So just Sean and me, and then every year we've kind of added 1 or 2 more, and now it's a full band.
Was the clever name there from the beginning, the Pride Pipers?
I came up with it. I don't remember. It didn't seem. It seemed pretty obvious to me. Actually, I think I did a search because I figured it wasn't possible that there couldn't be another Pride Piper organization somewhere else in the world, but I'm not sure that there is, which is weird.
Well, my hat's off to you, Mark, because between I'm enthusiastic about folklore. I'm very enthusiastic about alliteration, and so and I really like clever marketing, and those 3 came together perfectly in that name. Okay. I love it.
How about that? Yes,
well done.
Yeah. That's been a nice gig to do as well. Once again, it attracts people from. It's different. That's a whole different vibe in and of itself, right? It's not like bar piping. It's not like playing for a funeral. Far from it. It's not like It's not like playing in front of a judge.
Yeah, certainly not competition.
Once again, it's this kind of community outreach type of thing, I guess you could say. But it's also, because it's associated with the parade itself, it's sort of a very kind of jubilant kind of thing. But not to make it sound so trivial though, because there's a big reason why there are pride parades.
Right.
And
of course,
that, and so I take it I don't just show up flippantly. I take it very seriously because I see myself as an advocate, and it's not a whole lot different from when I'm honored to be able to play for somebody's funeral.
Yeah.
I'm honored to be able to play for the pride parade because of what it means. So, and I take that responsibility pretty seriously. And so I want to put on a good show, and I want to show solidarity, right? So that's why I do it.
On the surface, I wouldn't have thought of such a connection, and maybe I'm not even psychologically prepared to dive into the connection, but just because of like your somber attire and repertoire at a funeral compared to the streamers and colors of the Pride Parade, but man, the connection between advocacy and funerals and trying to avoid them in a way, that's there is a strong connection there, isn't there?
Very much so, yeah, very much so. So, and once again, I also, like, through my piping with the Heathen Highlanders, that has sort of merged, I would say, into doing a lot of honor guard activities as well. Yeah. Which partly it's because Mike, Dave, who's in the Heathen Highlanders, works is a corrections officer, right? He works for the police department. Yeah. So therefore, I've ended up playing for a lot of high-profile funerals with a bigger group, with the honor guard, with the firefighters band, and so those are somber occasions where once again you want to do a good job, but it's not about you; it's about them, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so you have to make sure that you're approaching it with the right mindset, I think. And,
you want to do a good job, but you don't want to be stealing the show, as it were.
Exactly. Yeah. So you want to enhance that sad event. Pride Parade, I think I bring into it the same sort of sensibility in the sense that I want to enhance that joyful event. Whilst realizing, that the reason that it happens in the first place is because of difficulties, I guess, people have had over the years, right? Yeah. So it doesn't matter what I'm doing. Whenever I stand out in front of a crowd, I try to contextualize, what I'm doing and make sure I give it my best, I would say.
Well, it may well be, Mark, that is the perfect way to go out on this episode.
Okay.
Just because it was lovely. Just in case, though, this might get tacked on, I often ask people how they feel about pineapple on pizza. So what the heck? How do you feel about pineapple on pizza?
It's not something I would default to.
Yeah. Are you being careful because you know how popular it is here in Utah?
Growing up in the UK, you learn to eat all sorts of garbage. And so your palate becomes kind of numbed, I would say. So
I've heard food in the UK bashed before, but never quite so eloquently. That was
so because of that, I could eat a piece of pizza with pineapple on it and not really think about it. But it's definitely
because
not something.
Worse.
It's not something I would seek out.
I gotcha.
When I was a student, my buddy used to go to this pizza place in the next town over because they had a pizza that had chili on it.
Oh wow!
It was called the Mexican Way. I remember it, and it was just a pizza covered in chili, basically. And so he thought it was the best thing ever. And I think he would come back with that and with pizza that had pineapple on it. So there was your choice between chili pizza or pineapple pizza.
So for you,